So you now know how to use Flexbox to create one-dimensional rows and columns, which is great. But there's another tool, another layout model called CSS Grid that allows you to create layouts that are a little more complex because it's two-dimensional. You have complete control over columns and rows. So we have properties like grid template columns and grid template rows that allow you to specify exactly how many rows and columns you want and exactly how wide you want them, whether that's in pixels, percentages, or a new unit that we're going to learn called fractions or FR. Okay, and we have certain functions we can use like repeat and minmax. There's certain keywords like autofill and autofit that we can use within the repeat function. So we're going to learn all about that. Justify content, align items, you can still use that with a grid layout. We've been using that with Flexbox. And then position and spanning, so you can position your rows and columns where you want, and you can also span across multiple rows and columns. And then grid and media queries, just like we learned how to use media queries with Flex, we'll learn how to use it with the grid. And then there's another way of using CSS Grid, and that's using grid template areas, which is pretty cool because you basically map it out in your CSS physically. You basically type out different areas, and it will reflect that in your layout. And I know that doesn't make much sense just saying it, but when we get to it, it'll make a lot more sense. And then at the end, we're going to refactor the Lumina creative website and take the projects area, the image gallery, and change it from Flexbox to a two-dimensional grid, and we'll have some of them actually span multiple rows and columns. So an image gallery is a great example of where CSS Grid really shines. You can use it for just simple, 3-card layouts or whatever, just like we use it for with Flexbox, but you can do some really cool, complex stuff as well. All right, so in the next video, we're going to talk a little bit more about what CSS Grid is. Okay, so now we're going to get into CSS Grid, which is a layout system that provides properties to create rows and columns in a two-dimensional grid layout, which is a little different than Flexbox, and I'll talk about that. But the way that they're implemented is very similar. So just like you use display flex, you would use the display property and set that to grid, and that creates a grid container, and any direct children are grid items, just like you would have a flex container with flex items. And CSS Grid it's supported in all modern browsers. It is partially supported in IE if you still take IE into consideration, which I don't. But if you do, you just might want to see which properties are supported. Now, when I say CSS Grid is two-dimensional, I mean that you have precise control over both rows and columns simultaneously, which is something you can't really do with Flexbox. And this enables developers to create intricate layouts with ease and arrange elements not only horizontally and vertically, but also in relation to each other across the grid. Okay, so if you look at this under the hero, you have the menu, spanning all the way down. You have the main and the banner, and then you have extra. So this cuts off here, and then you have image. So you can't really do this with Flexbox. Okay, like you can't span rows and columns in this way. You would have to use multiple flex boxes, where this whole part right here could be wrapped in a single div that is set to display grid. And then there's a whole bunch of properties you can use to, set your columns and rows how you want. Now, when it comes to CSS Grid versus Flexbox, they're similar, but they do have slightly different use cases. And there's not one that's better than the other. They're just different, and a lot of it comes down to preference. So Flexbox, I guess I could say this is my opinion, but it's best suited for laying out items in a single dimension, such as a column or a row. It's great for creating responsive designs and aligning items within a container. If you have a single row of cards or a single column of content, Flexbox is great for that. CSS Grid, on the other hand, is best suited for creating more complex layouts with multiple rows and columns. So it's great for creating grid-based designs like photo galleries, things like that, and just aligning items in 2 dimensions. However, you can still use CSS Grid for just like a single row of cards. Now, again, this comes down to preference. Some people only use one or the other, which I don't really like that. I use both. I think I would say most people use both. For me, I like to use CSS Grid for the main layout of a page or the big picture, and then I'll use Flexbox to style inner elements. So to give you an example, if we look at, where is it? If we look at my site here and we look at the latest courses, so I might use CSS Grid to create these cards, right? These cards here, or even this as a grid. And then I would use Flexbox to align the items inside of each card, right? So aligning the logo over to the right, right? Maybe make this a flex column. So anything within the overall layout, I would use Flexbox for. So like a navigation to align the links horizontally, I would use Flex for that. Very rarely would I use CSS Grid to create a navigation menu. CSS Grid is more for the overall parts of the layout, if that makes sense. Now I just want to give you an overview of the properties, and we're going to learn all about these as we move along. So first we have display grid, which obviously it defines the parent container as a grid. Then we have grid template rows, which defines the number and size of rows in the grid. Grid template columns defines the number of size, the number and size of columns in the grid. Now with Flexbox, when you set display flex, it automatically creates a row, right? It automatically puts everything horizontally. If you set display grid, it doesn't do anything, because in addition to that, I mean, there's a few ways that you could create a grid, but in addition to that, you would need to add something like grid template columns and then define the number of columns that you want. Okay, so it's an extra step, but it's also it makes things easier, because you can just say, you know, I want 3 columns that are 300 pixels wide or whatever. So grid gap, which you can shorten to just gap, works in the same way that gap works with Flexbox. It just provides space around each grid item. Then you have grid column and grid row, and these will place a grid item within a specific column or row range. Grid area will place a grid item within a specific area of the grid, because we can create something called templates, which are really cool. We'll get into those later. And then you also have the alignment stuff that we use with Flexbox. You have justify items, align items, justify content, align content. So, you know, if you're familiar with centering or adding, you know, space between for justify content, if you're familiar with that with Flexbox, then you're going to be familiar with that with CSS Grid as well. All right, so don't let this overwhelm you, all these properties. We're going to go over all of these and some others. We're going to look at specific functions that we can use, like minmax and autofill and autofit. So I think in the next video, we're just going to start simple, and we're going to focus mostly on grid template columns, which allows you to specify the size and the layout of columns. Okay, so we're going to get started with CSS Grid, and I'm in the 01 Grid Columns folder. And basically, what I want to look at here is the property Grid Template Columns. Okay, so let's get rid of this. Oh, we'll keep the H1, that's fine. But let's go underneath it, and let's create a container. And again, I usually like to use the class of container to set the max width and also the margin auto and any padding. So basically just placement and spacing. And then I would add another class, like let's say item grid, to actually create the grid. That's just what I like to do. If you want to just set the grid on the container class, that's fine as well. There's no right or wrong way. So in this, let's create, we'll use Emmet here. Let's create a class of item, and then also a class of item dash and then $sign. And then inside that, we'll have item and then $sign. And let's do 6 of them, so times 6. All right, so we have these 6 items. Let's go into the style sheet, and from here we'll add our container styles. So let's set a max width of 1100 pixels. we'll do margin, we'll move it down a little bit, so 30 pixels, and then auto, and we'll also set a background of F4 3 times. Okay, and then for the items themselves, let's set a background color of coral, and padding, we'll do 1 rem, and border, we'll do 1 pixel solid and dark gray, and we'll text align to the center. All right, so I'm going to make the browser a little bigger so we can see this a little better. So we just have a bunch of items. We didn't set any display or anything yet. So I'm going to use the item grid as my grid container. So let's say item grid, and then we're going to set display. Now, if I set display flex, they go into a row automatically. But remember, when you set grid, it doesn't. Okay, it doesn't do anything. So one way we can start to work with grid is with the property grid template columns. So let's do that. Grid and template dash columns. So this allows us to specify exactly how many columns we want. And when I say columns, I mean, 1 column, 2 column, 3 column. Rows go this way. Like these would be rows. So how many columns do I want? Let's say I want 3 that are 100 pixels wide each. So I would just simply say 100 pixels, 100 pixels. So however many times I put 100 pixels is how many columns I'm going to get. That will give me 2, right? And then it'll just keep going. Like if there's more than 2, it'll go on to the next line. It'll have another 2 and then another 2, which is nice. So if we want 3, let's do 100 pixels for the third one. Now we have a grid that has 3 columns each. Okay, or in this case, 3 columns, 2 rows. And if I were to add, let's say we add 3 more here, 3 more divs, and we'll just change this to 7, 7, 8, and 9. Save that, and now automatically it goes on to the next row and fills up 3. If I don't have 3 on the next row, you see that it'll just take up the 2. So what I really like about CSS Grid versus Flexbox is just how explicit you are. Like I just want 3 columns of that are 100 pixels wide, rather than having to do flex grow, flex shrink, flex basis, and all that stuff. We can control the sizing from the container. Now, you don't have to use pixels. In fact, very rarely do I use pixels. We usually use something called fractions or fractional units, and I'll get to those. But if you wanted to use like percentages, you could. So I could say like, say 70% and then 30%, and that gives me, I get 2 columns. The first one's 70, the next one 30. If I wanted, let's say, 3 that are even, we could do 33.33%, and we could do that 3 times, and now we have 3. However, this isn't really a good way to do this because you can use fractional units, which are much easier to understand. Another thing you could do is use auto. So if I were to do auto, that'll give me 2 that are the same size. Auto again, that gives me 4. So it's just so simple. So now we'll look at fraction units. And what this does is an FR, or fraction unit, represents a fraction of the available space in the container. So if I want 3 rows, I could do 1 FR, 1 FR, 1 FR. And that gives me 3 that are even. If I wanted to make the first one a little bigger, I could do 2 FR. Now the first one's bigger. If I wanted the last one to be 2 as well and create that kind of layout, we could do that. If I wanted the middle one to be the biggest, I could do that. So really, really cool and really easy. And I also wanted to show you that in the dev tools, just like you have the flex helpers, you have grid. So right here, since this is display grid, it has this. If I click that, it'll actually show me the beginning and the end of each column in each row. And later on, we'll be able to say, well, I want item 1 to span from 1 to 3. So this can be pretty helpful. And you can even click on this thing right here, and you can select these different alignment properties. So like justify items to the center, to the start, to the end. So pretty cool, just to kind of experiment with the layouts. I also don't have to use just one unit. Like if I wanted to set this to, let's say 300 pixels, and then maybe just take the rest of the space and split them up between those two, could do that. Make that a little bigger, 600 pixels. Okay, and then these two would be equal and take up the rest of the space. And then for gap, we can do the same thing that we do with Flexbox, and we can use gap. But before I show you that, I want to show you we can also do gap if we want it just horizontally or just vertically. So for instance, if I say grid row gap and set that to 20 pixels, it's only going to add the space on the row or going horizontally. And then if I want spacing on, let's comment that out. If I want spacing going vertically, we could say column gap, and now it adds space there. Now, in most cases, you're probably going to want space going both ways. So in that case, you could say grid-gap 20 pixels, but you can also shorten it to just gap, just like you would with Flexbox. That does the same thing. Okay, so that's gap, that's grid template columns. In the next video, I want to look at a couple functions that are available with CSS Grid. One is called repeat, because if we have, 10 columns, rather than typing it all out, we can use the repeat function. And then I also want to show you something called minmax. So now we're going to look at repeat and minmax. So I basically just have what we left off with as far as the 9 items here, although I just got rid of all the grid stuff. So let's go ahead and set this to display grid again. And then I'm going to set the grid template columns, except let's say I want to do three columns that are all equal. So one FR, one FR, one FR. I mean, if I wanted 6, 8, I'd have to keep typing this one FR. So that will work, obviously, but instead of typing out one FR 3 times, we can simply say repeat, which is going to take in 2 things. It's going to take in the number of times you want this to repeat, which I'm going to do 3, and then the unit, so 1 FR, or the size, I should say. And you'll see that does the same thing. So if I wanted 6 columns, I could do that. If I wanted 5 columns, I could do that, and so on. So let's put it back to 3. And then if I were to change this to like 100 pixels, then I'd have three columns that are each 100 pixels wide. So that's repeat. Very simple to understand. And a lot of the times, these are the only 2 things that you're going to need to create your columns, right? If you have a card or you have a set of 3 or 4 cards, you can simply use these 2. All right, now min-max is something that you probably won't use all the time, but it can be useful, and it defines a size range, and it takes in 2 arguments, the minimum size and the maximum size. So let's say that we want to have some columns that are at least 200 pixels, but at the most 300 pixels. So we can use min-max here, and we can use that within repeat. So let's go within the repeat and say 3 times, and then min max, and we want to go from 200 pixels as a minimum, 300 pixels as a maximum. Okay, so if I do that, these are going to be 200 at the minimum. Stretch it out, they'll be 300 at the maximum. And what I usually find myself doing is using fractions for this. So if we want 3 that are all the same, so all 1 FR, but we want the minimum to be 200 pixels, then we could do that. So now it's not going to be, they're not going to be less than 200. If I put 300 here, then they're not going to be less than 300. And I mean, you don't have to use min-max within repeat. Of course, you could just do grid template columns and just do min-max. Let's say we want to do min-max 200 1FR, and then just do it again, min-max 200, do 3 of them, and we get the same thing. All right, so pretty simple functions to understand. What I want to do next is look at the grid row, or I'm sorry, grid template rows property. All right, so we know how to use grid template columns. Now we're going to look at grid template rows, which allows us to define rows. Okay, so columns go vertical, rows go horizontal. So let's jump in here and let's just create a container, and then I'm also going to have an item grid. And inside here, let's do a class of item and then a class of item dash $. Inside that, we'll do item space $, and then let's do 6 of these, so times 6. And then we'll jump into the CSS and let's do the container, which will do a max width of 1100 pixels. And let's do a margin 30 pixels top and bottom, auto left and right, and we'll just give it a background of light gray. All right, and then the item grid class, item grid, actually I'm going to move the background into that. Yeah, and then let's display grid. Okay, now that doesn't, obviously that doesn't do anything. Before we add our grid template rows, I just want to style the items themselves. So let's say for the item, we want a background color of coral. And let's do some padding. Let's do a border of 1 pixel, solid 333, and then let's text align to the center. Okay, so there's our grid items. Now I'm going to come back up here to the grid container and I'm going to say grid dash template, and instead of columns we're going to do rows. Now this essentially works the same way. We add the size for and however many rows we want. So let's say we want 100 pixels, that's one row, 200 pixels, that's the second, 300 pixels, that's a third. If I save that, you'll see now we have 100 pixel, 200, and 300. And the rest are just going to be whatever, whatever the content takes up. Now, these don't have to be pixels, just like with columns, we can do fraction units. So we can say like 1FR, let's say 1FR, 2FR, 3FR, and that's what we get. So 1FR is kind of just, just takes up the content space, and then we got the 2FR and then the 3FR. And we can mix and match these. So let's say I wanted the first one to be like 200 pixels. We can do that. And then the next one is 2FR and then 3FR. Now you might want to control the rest of the rows, because here we're only defining 3 rows, but we actually have 6. We have 6 rows here. So if you want to, let's say you want the rest of these to be 100 pixels, then we could set a property called grid auto rows. And if I set that to 100 pixels, then any new rows that I add are going to be 100 pixels. Now I just want to mention that you're not going to use, or you're probably not going to use grid template rows as much as you're going to use grid template columns. Okay, because usually we're dealing with the width of things, and we let the content dictate the height for a lot of elements in HTML. So just want to mention that. Now we can also mix and match grid template rows and grid template columns. So for instance, let's put this back to 1FR, and then let's add grid template columns, and let's do the same thing, 1FR, 2FR, 3FR. All right, so now what happens is we have 1FR for the first row, and we have 1FR for the first column. We have 2FR for the second row. We have 2FR for the second column. We have 3FR for the third row, but there is no third row, right? So obviously we don't have anything here, but the third column is also 3FR. And then if I were to add on to this, like let's say copy this down and change this to 7, if I do that, it's just going to go in the next spot it's supposed to. So it's going to be 1FR, both column and row. So we have a lot of flexibility here to create pretty much any layout we want. We haven't even gone into like spanning columns and rows or anything yet. So in the next video, I want to take what we've learned so far and have you do a little challenge where you're going to use grid template rows and grid template columns. And then we'll start to get into alignment and template areas and things like that. Okay, so I got a quick challenge for you guys. This is one of a couple of challenges that we're going to have, and it's pretty simple because obviously we haven't learned too much, so I'm only going to ask of you what I've already showed you. So we're going to have 12 items, grid items inside of a container. You get some initial CSS here, and then I want you to create a grid that looks like this. There's 12 items, and your task is to create a grid with 3 columns and 4 rows, where the first row should have a height of 1FR, the second 2FR, the third 3FR, and the fourth and everything after that should be 4FR. Okay, so that's the rows. And then for the columns, you should have 3 that are 1FR each and should have a gap of 1 rem between the rows and columns. So it should look just like this. All right, so you can pause the video, try it out. I have the solution down here as well, and we're gonna just go ahead and do this ourselves. So we might as well just, we already have the HTML and CSS here, so we might as well just grab this. If you want to type it out, you can. And then we'll grab the initial CSS and paste that in. All right, so we have our elements, and we want to, on the item grid is where we want to set display grid. And then if we look back at the instructions, we know that we want to have 3 columns that are all 1FR. So why don't we do that first? We'll say grid template columns and set, let's use repeat, or you can just put it in 3 times. So we want to repeat 3 times 1FR. Okay, so that takes care of that. We also know that it should have a gap of 1 rem. So let's add that. So gap is going to be 1 rem. And then we want the, let's see, the first row, so it's basically going to be 1FR, 2FR, 3FR, and then the rest 4. So why don't we add grid template rows, and let's do 1FR, 2FR, 3FR. Okay, but the fourth one and anything after that should be, what is it, 4? Yeah, anything after that should be 4FR. So remember the property grid auto rows. We can set that to 4FR. All right, and that should do it. Let's take a look at the image. Okay, I mean, this is a little wider, but yeah, so same thing. So if you got it, congratulations. I know it was kind of an easy one. But, and if you didn't get it, that's fine too. I mean, we're going to be using these properties as we move along, and you'll get more comfortable with them as we go through the course. All right, so when we learned Flexbox, we learned about some of the properties like justify content, align items, and these are really helpful because they allow us to easily align all the items in the grid. Well, I'm sorry, within the Flexbox. With the grid, we have those same properties, and we have some others as well. So I just want to go over those real quick, and then I'll give you an example. So we have justify items, which will align the items inside the grid along the row axis, which is the X, or the horizontal axis. And then align items, which will align the items inside the grid along the column axis, or the Y axis. Then we have justify content, which aligns the grid along the row axis. So notice that with the dash items, we're aligning the items inside the grid. With justify content and align content, we're aligning the grid along the row or column axis. And then we also have place items, which is a shorthand for align items and justify items. And then place content, which is a shorthand for align content and justify content. So let's look at some examples here. So I already have a grid, and you can see we just have 9 items inside of a container. Item grid is the class we're using to set the grid and the columns and rows. And basically we just have, here's the whole style sheet. So basically we just have 3 columns that are 200 pixels wide and 3 rows that are 100 pixels tall. So let's start off with justify dash. Let's do justify content because we've been using that a lot already. So the default for this is, I believe, start, right? So if we do justify start and I save that, we get no difference, right? If we do end, then it moves all the items to the end of the container. We can also do center. So if I do center, it moves it to the middle. We can do space between. So same stuff we've been doing with flex. It'll put it between. If you want it on the sides as well, then we could use space around. So now we have space on the sides as well. You can also do space evenly, and that will have it even on the sides and in the middle. All right, now if we use, let's comment that out. If we use justify items instead of justify content, that pertains to the items themselves. So let's say justify items, and let's do center. I believe the default is stretch. So if I do center, then it doesn't move them all in the container. Now it's just aligning each item to the center. If I do start, then it moves them to the start. If I do end, moves them to the end, and then stretch is the default, and that will just take up the whole thing. Okay, so that's justify. That's the difference between justify content and justify items. And then we have align items and align content, which do the same thing. So let's say align dash items, and let's do center. And there we go. So it's each individual item. If I do end, then it moves them to the end, and so on. All right, if we do align content, and let's do end for that, I mean, there's really no difference here because of the height. So if we change the height of the container, then we'll be able to see this. So let's change it to 600 pixels because right now it takes up the entire height. But if we have more height than it takes up, then it's going to move to the end. If I do start, it's going to go to the start. If I do center, it'll go to the center. If I do space between, it'll put the space between. We can do space evenly. And what's the other one? Space around. All right, so if we do space around, there we go. So that's align content. And then we also have place content and place items, which just combine both justify content and align content. Actually, I should probably put those together. So if you want to set both of these to the same thing, then you could do place content and then space around. Just comment this out. Save that, and now you can see that both of those are applied, right? If you want both of these to be set to something, you could use place items and let's say center. So if we do that, it's the same as setting align items and justify items to center. But even with the grid, I find myself using justify content and align items in a very similar way that I use it with Flexbox. All right, but we'll do more of this as we move through the projects and stuff. So in the next video, we're going to look at positioning our grid items in certain areas and spanning a certain number of columns and a certain number of rows. All right, guys, so now we're going to take a look at 2 keywords that we can use with the repeat function, and that's autofill and autofit, which are similar but a little bit different. So these keywords are used to create a grid with a dynamic number of columns, and they're useful if you're not going to know how many items are going to be in the grid. And up to this point, we've been using the repeat function with a fixed number of columns. So let's see how we can use these keywords. So I'm going to jump in and just create, like we have been, a container and item grid class, or item dash grid. And then let's go in there and let's create 6 items. So we'll do item and then item dash $, and inside that item space $, and we want 6, so times 6. All right, let's jump into the style sheet and just add the container. And I know that this is getting a little bit repetitive, but again, it's good to just keep writing this stuff and drilling it into your head. So let's do a 600 pixel max width, and let's do a margin of 30 pixels auto, and let's set the background to light gray. Okay, and then for each item, we'll do a background color of coral, a border, 1 pixel solid and dark gray, padding, 1 rem, and text align center. Okay, and then for the item grid, we're going to add a display property and set that to grid. And then for now, I'm just going to use grid template columns like we have been, and let's just add a fixed number in repeat. So we'll say repeat 3 times 100 pixels. Okay, so what we have here is a 600 pixel wide container, and then each item is 100 pixels, and we have that spread across 3. Now, what if I want the grid to have as many columns as possible with a minimum item size of 100 pixels? Well, I could set this, I can see that, 6 will fit in there, so I could do that, and it fills the entire container. But what if I want to add more items and or change the width of the container? So if I were to change the width, so let's say up here, change the width to 800 pixels, right? And then let's say I add in, maybe we have 10 of these, okay? They could be coming from a database, so you don't know exactly how many we're going to have. So we'll do 7, 8, 9, and 10. Okay, so it's not filling the whole thing, right? Because again, I have this set to a fixed 6. So what I can do if I want them to go all the way across is use autofit. So I'm going to pass in here, instead of 6, let's say autofit. And now it'll go all the way across. And they all fit perfectly because they're 100 pixels, and we're at a max width of 800 pixels. But if I make the browser smaller, you'll see that they will fit, but we do have some space right here because the next 100 pixel cannot fit in there. You can actually fix that by using minmax. Instead of setting this to 100 pixels, we'll keep the first at autofit, but then let's use minmax, and let's say 100 pixels, minimum 1 FR max, save it, and now it stretches across and it'll fit, because now they can adjust because it's not a fixed 100 pixels. Now this is going to work the same whether I use autofit or autofill. If I save that, it's the same exact thing. So let me show you where these two differ. And I'm going to do that by taking out some of these and only having 6. So if we use, this is the difference, if we use autofill and we have some space here, it will leave the space. However, if we use autofit, then it'll stretch out and it will fill that space. So that's the big difference. With autofill, it'll create as many columns as possible, and it'll, even if there's empty space, it'll leave it. With autofit, it'll create as many columns as possible without any empty space. So this allows you to create really dynamic grids. And I mean, this is something that I might use for like an image gallery, something where we're going to have a lot of items, and you don't know, exactly how many items you're going to have. Maybe you have an application where you upload photos and it shows on the screen, and you never know how many photos are going to be there at one time, and you want them to resize and be dynamic. That's what this is a good case for. If you're just creating a card layout where you have a couple content cards, I would just say, grid template columns 1 FR 3 times, and that's that. And then create a media query and stack them on small screens just like you would do with Flexbox. All right, but it's good to know this other stuff so you have, you have all this in your toolbox so you can create pretty much any dynamic layout that you want. Okay, so now we're going to look at positioning grid items and spanning columns and rows, because we don't have to just have, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. We can have 1 go over to here, or we can have 2 go down to here. It's very flexible. Now, before we get into that, there's one property that I want to show you that I kind of forgot to show you, and that is grid template. And it's just a shorthand of both of these, grid template columns and grid template rows. All right, so I have 9 items here, same thing, just a container, item, grid, and then just the default styling, just like we've been doing. I just didn't want to type it out again. And let me just show you the grid dash template. Okay, so basically what we do is we have the columns. So I'm sorry, we could do the rows first. So whatever we have for rows, we can put here, and then we can just do slash, and then we can take what we have for the columns, put that there, and then I'm going to just comment out these 2 lines and save, and you see I have the same thing. Okay, and if I were to change this to 2, there we go, now we have 2 columns, so it's just a shorthand for this. I usually use both of these, but I know a lot of people like to do things the shortest way possible, so you can use that if you want. All right, now before we look into positioning, let's talk about grid lines. So grid lines are the horizontal and vertical lines that make up the grid, and they start at 1 and then they increment. And with Chrome and Firefox, I'm pretty sure you might have this with other browsers as well, but with Chrome and Firefox, if we open up the dev tools, we can see the grid lines by clicking on this button right here, grid. And you can even go to over here and go to layout, and you can do like show track sizes. So that'll show the sizes from 1 to 2, from 2 to 3. You can do extend grid lines so they go beyond the container. But these are the lines. If we're looking at columns, we're looking at 1 to 2. So that's the first column, 2 to 3, 3 to 4. Right? If we're looking at rows, we're going 1 to 2, 2 to 3. Now you can use these lines in your CSS using the grid column and grid row properties. So if I want item 1 to go from 1 to 3, I can do that. All right, in fact, let's do that. So let's go into our CSS. Now we need to target specific items to do this. And we have the classes of item 1 to item 9. So let's take the first one. So we'll say item-1, and you could use pseudo classes if you want. You could use like first child or nth child or nth of type, whatever. We already went over that. And then again, I want to expand item 1 to go from 1 to 3. And there's a few different ways to do that. There's a longer way and there's a shorter way. So I'll show you the longer way first, and that is to do grid dash column dash start. So remember, when we're talking about columns, we're talking about these numbers at the top. So we want it to start at 1, right? And then we want it to go to 3. So let's say grid column start 1, and then let's say grid column end 3. So it starts at 1 and it ends at 3. And now if we take a look, you can see item 1 is going from 1 to 3. All right. Now the shorter way to do this, I'll just comment this out. The shorter way is to just use the grid column property. So let's say grid column, and then we can just do 1/3. So that's doing the same thing. If I save, we have the same layout. So we're just saying we want it to start at 1 and we want it to end at 3. Now we can do the same thing with rows. We can span rows as well. So why don't we target a different one? Let's say item-3, which is this one here. And let's say that I want this one to go from here down to here. So I want it to span, this. So it's going to go 2 to 4. And it's rows this time, not columns. So let's say grid, and again, we have the long way and the short way. We can do grid row start and start at 2. And then we can do grid row end, and let's end at 4. So now if we take a look, there we go. So we have item 3 going from 2 to 4. And then just like with columns, with grid column, we also have grid row. And I could say I want it to go from 2 to 4. Save it, we get the same thing. And just remember, when you're spanning elements, it's going to affect the end, right? It's going to push things over. It's going to shift. So just keep that in mind. Now let's say we want this last one, item 9, to go from 2 to, let's say, 4, because we want to fill in this area. So let's take item 9, and let's say we want to go grid column, and we want to set that to go from 2, right? Yeah, 2 to 4. Save it, and now that covers that area. Now we can also use the span keyword. So this is another way to do the same thing. And it's important to know these because you're going to run into them and you want to know what they're doing. I mean, when it comes to you writing your own CSS, you're going to have your ways of doing it, but you want to know all the different ways. So we could also say for item 1, instead of 1/3, we could say grid column, and then we could say we want to start at 1, but then we want to span 2. Okay, so we're just saying start at 1, but span 2. So this is the first one, this is the second one. We want to span both. So I'm going to comment out that, and we get the same thing, right? For this one here, we can say grid row, and we want to start at 2, and then we want to span 2. Okay, again, that's going to start at 2 here at the column, row, and then go to 4. So it's going to span 2. And then this one, we can comment that out, and then comment this out, and let's say grid column, and again, we want to start at 2, and we want to span 2. Now, there is a shorthand for this. So for the first one, we're starting where it naturally is, right? Meaning I'm not changing the starting point. It starts at 1 regardless. So we don't even need to do that. We can just simply say span 2. And then same thing with item 3. It's starting at 2. Okay, it's starting at 2 naturally, so we don't need to put 2. We can just say span 2. Same thing here. We can just say span 2. All right, so if you're keeping the beginning, the start, where it naturally lands, then all you have to do is say span 2, span 3, or whatever. Now, if you were starting item 1 at, let's say, 3, then you would want to put 3, because that's not where it naturally starts. So now item 1 is starting at 3, right? But a lot of the times, it's just going to start where it is, and then you're just going to span a few columns or a few rows. All right, so in the next video, I want to look at alignment. So we'll look at, justify content, align items, and so on. Okay, so now we're going to talk about naming our grid lines. And this is something that's completely optional, but again, you should know how to do it. So I have our 9 items that we've been working with, and then just have some base CSS here. I haven't done any grid columns or anything yet, but I want to go over and show the grid lines. So in the dev tools, let's hit the grid and make sure that you have, let's see, actually you don't have to, but I like to extend the grid lines. But what we're going to do is name our lines, right? So before we do anything, let's set our grid template columns. Okay, and we're just going to do, I'm not going to use repeat here. I'm going to do 1FR 3 times. And then I'm going to do grid template rows, and same thing, 1FR 3 times. Okay, now if we look at the grid lines, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 for the columns, right? Now we can name these. So for the first one, right here, we're going to put in some brackets, and let's say call-1-start. So that's what I'm naming it. Now if I save that, and I come down here in my dev tools, we can actually select from this drop down, show line names. If I do that, now we can see our call-1-start. Now for the next one, which will be, this will be the line, this is going to be call-1-end, but it's also call-2-start. So let's go here, let's put some brackets in and say call-1-end space call-2-start. Save it, and now we have that line named. Okay, go to the next one. So after that FR, we'll do call-2-end space call-3-start. start. So now we have that one named. Now let's do the last one. So right here, we're going to say call dash 3 dash end. And actually that's it, because there is no fourth column, right? We only have 1, 2, 3 columns, and that's the end of the third one. Now we can do the same thing for rows. So let's go down to grid template rows, and let's put in some brackets, and let's say row dash 1 dash start. Come over here, that's going to be row dash 1 dash end, and row dash 2 dash start. Then here we have row dash 2 end, row 3 start, and then wait a minute, did I do that right? 1 row, 1 end, 2 start, 2 end, 3 start, yeah, and then row 3 end. Okay, so now we have those named, and those are now showing here. So if I wanted to do some spanning, I could actually use those names. So let's create the same layout we did in the last video. We'll take item 1, and let's say we want to grid column start. Now, instead of just putting 1, I could put the name, which is just, it's a little more descriptive. It's more characters to type, but it's more descriptive. So call 1 start. So we're starting here, call 1 start, and then where we want it to end would be right here. And this is technically 2 names, so I could use either call 3 start or call 2 end. So let's bring that down, and let's say grid column end, and we'll say column 2 end, because that's this one here, right? So if I save that, now item 1 spans to that one. And then I could also do column 3 start, and that brings it to the same one, because both names are the same line. But I'm going to put that to call 2 end. And then let's say we want item 3 to go from row 2 start to row 3 end, which would be right here. So let's say item dash 3, and then grid column start is going to be row 2 start, right? And then where we want it to end, so grid, sorry, this should be row, not column. So row start, row end, and let's end it at row 3 dash end. All right, so now it's going to span here, row 2 start down to row 3 end. And then the last one I want to do is item 9. I want it to go from call 2 start to call 3 end. So let's say item 9, and grid column start is going to be call, what is it, call 2 start, and then let's end it at call 3 end. And now it goes from here to here. So it's just an alternative way. If you want to use the numbers, that's absolutely fine. And of course, you could also use your grid column, and we could comment these out, and you could say call 1 start, and then slash call 2 dash end. Save it, and we get the same result. So you can use your named lines, whether you're using these properties or grid column or grid row. All right, so in the next video, we're going to do the second challenge for the grid section. All right, so we're going to do our second grid challenge, and if you're really comfortable with this stuff, you might just want to pause the video now and just create this layout. It doesn't matter if your CSS matches mine totally, as long as it looks like this and the correct things are spanned. But you can pause the video now, or I'm going to give you guys just a couple hints. So if we look at this image, you can see that it's 2 columns, right? 1, 2, and then 4 rows. And we have our lines, which would be our column lines 1, 2, 3, and our row lines 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Although we're not spanning any rows, so the column lines don't really matter. We're just spanning the header and the footer. And then for the sizing of the rows, I mean, you could set the header, nav, and footer to really anything, like 100 pixels, or I'll probably set it to auto. And then the middle would be 1FR, because that's taking up the rest of the space. All right, but that's as much as I'm going to say because I kind of gave you the answer already. But pause the video, try it out, and then come back. So I'm going to jump into the HTML, and there's nothing really that I need to do here. I just want to take a look at it. We have our container, and then we have our direct child tags, which are going to be the items, right? We have a header, nav, a div with the class of search, main, aside, and footer. And then if we go to our style sheet, we just have some default styles. We do have container set to display grid already. So, and then just some padding and background colors. So let's go into the container, and we know that we want, what, 2 columns, right? And then 4 rows. So let's do the columns first. So grid, template, columns. And as far as the sizing goes for that, let's do, so this is obviously bigger than this. So let's do 2FR, 1FR, right? Because we want it to span the whole space. So I'm not going to set it to a fixed width or anything. So 2FR, 1FR. And that's going to split it up. All right, now the next thing we want to do is the rows. And we want 4 rows. So grid, template, dash rows. And like I said, I'm going to do auto for the header, auto for the nav, and auto for the footer. But the main content, I'm going to do 1FR. That'll take up the rest of the remaining space. Auto is basically just going to take up the height of the content. So let's save that. And now, I mean, we're already just about there, right? Except we want to span, the header wants to go from, we want it to go from here to the end. And if we look at our grid lines, if we click on this button right here, you can see we have 1, 2, 3. Right? That's what we want the header to span. So let's come down here, and we can either do grid, column, start, and we can start at 1, grid, column, end, and end at 3. Okay, so that will do it. Or you can just simply do grid, column, and then say span 2. So that is the same as these 2 lines. So we have the header going all the way across. And then the only other thing to do is the same thing on the footer. So I'll just copy that, go down to the footer, paste that in, and now the footer spans all the way. Let's turn off the grid lines, and now we have our layout. So very simple. In the next video, we're going to look at making grids responsive with media queries. All right, guys, so now we're going to look at media queries with the grid, and it works very similar to what you would do with Flexbox, right? Except what you're changing in the media query is a little bit different. With Flexbox, we either change the flex direction to column on small screens or set it to display block on small screens. With CSS Grid, we just need to change the number of columns. So if you have, let's say, repeat 1FR 3 times, then on small screens, you just change it to a single 1FR, which will stack all the items. So it's even easier in most cases with using media queries. So we're going to use the same layout that we just did in the little challenge, and we want to make it responsive so that when we hit a certain threshold, 768, that they all stack and we don't have the columns anymore. All right, and then we also have to take into account spanning because we don't want to have the span set on smaller screens either. All right, so let's jump into the CSS. And as far as the columns go, we have it set to 2 columns, 2FR and 1FR. On smaller screens, I'm just going to make this smaller, I want it to be a single column, so we'll just change that to 1FR in the media query. So let's come down here, let's say media, and we want to do a max width of 768, and then I'm going to take the container, and then let's set the grid template columns. We're going to set that to just a single column, 1FR. Now when I save it, you'll see it doesn't change. Now usually it would if you, let's say you just had a 3-card layout and you had 1FR 3 times. In the media query you set it to 1FR, it's going to stack when the screen is smaller. The reason it's not is because we have a span set, or we have a couple spans. We have one on the header and we have one on the footer. So we need to clear that in order for this to work. So let's come down here, let's get the header, and we can just simply set grid column, because we no longer want it to span. Well, we don't want it to span more than one, so we can just simply set span 1, right? So there's still 2 because the footer spans. So we could also just add in here, comma, footer. Now everything stacks. However, the rows now got screwed up. The search is what is big when really we want the main content bigger. And the reason for that is because we're no longer spanning the header, so it added more rows. So now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 rows. All right, so why don't we do this? Why don't we go into the container and let's set our grid template rows. And let's say for the header, we want that to be auto. We want the nav, which is the next one, to be auto. We want the search to be auto. And then we want the main content to be 1FR. And then anything after that, we will just have auto. So let's say grid. Technically, we don't really have to add this, but we will anyway. So we'll just say grid auto rows, which means the rest of the rows after wherever this ends, which in this case is 4 rows. So the 5th and on will be set to auto as well. And now we have our main content as the large area. All right, so when we get to 768, it splits. There's no more sidebar. Then there's a 1 column stacked layout. But again, if you're not using spans and you know, row grid template rows, because a lot of times you'll just have a 3 card or 4 card layout with some content, some text or images, and this is really all you have to do to make them stack on smaller screens. But just remember, when you're using spans, you have to kind of clear those up with span 1 on smaller screens. And of course, you can make much more complex layouts. I mean, you can have, you know, maybe five columns on really large screens. Then you get to 1,000 pixels, 900 pixels. You change it to, or maybe you have 6 on large screens, and then 4 on medium screens, 2 on small screens, and then stacked on really small screens. So you can do that, but I use this as just kind of my baseline for every layout that I create. So when it gets under 768, when you're on a tablet or a smartphone, then I'll just have my content stack on top of each other. All right, so next we're going to look at a really cool feature called grid template areas. All right, so now we're going to look at grid template areas, which are really cool because you create a physical representation of your layout within your CSS. And what I want to do is ultimately create this layout where we have the header and then the search on the side, the nav that goes across, the main content, and then the sidebar, and then the footer. So it's a bit different than the layout we just created. All right, and then we have some gap in the middle as well. So we're going to start off with the starter files, which has the container, and then it has a couple things commented out because I just want to focus on the header, search, and nav for now, which are going to be the header here, search, and then nav. And then in the style sheet, we just have the default, you know, padding and background colors. No grid stuff yet, except for display grid and gap 1 rem. Now, this is going to be a little different because we're not going to be using grid template columns and grid template rows. This is a different way of doing things. It's not in addition, it's something, it's an alternative. So, and I would suggest using this for things that are complex and things where you want a single grid with a large layout inside. You're not going to use this to just put a couple columns side by side. You're going to use this for entire layouts. So the property that we're going to use on the container is called grid template areas. And then what we do is we specify each row and each column with some text. So for instance, this is going to represent the first column, first row, and I want the header. All right, and I'll show you how we map this text to the elements in a minute. But we want the header, and then on the next row, I'm going to have the search, because right now I'm just going to stack them. So header, search, and then the nav. Okay, now to basically connect this to the elements, we use a property called grid area. So for this header, I want the header element to pertain to that. So I'm going to use grid area, and I'm going to set that to header because that's what I called it here. I could call this anything, but obviously these have to match. So for the search, I want the search class to pertain to that, so I'll say grid area search. And then for, what do I got, the nav, we want the, where's the, oh, right here. So for the nav, we're going to say grid area nav. So now those elements are connected to these, okay? And then the next thing I'm going to do is I want the search on the side, just like this image right here. So why don't we take the search and put that here, search. Now each row has to have the same amount of columns. So I want the nav on the second. However, I can't have nav just once. If I do that, it's going to look all weird. So we want nav here as well. All right, so notice that what we're writing in our CSS is physically similar to what we're doing here. We have header, search, nav, nav. Header, search, nav, nav. All right, and the one thing that kind of trips people up is having, you know, this goes all the way across, so it might seem like you do this because it's just one, you know, one area, but it's spanning two columns, so you want to have it twice. All right, so now let's, and we can see this too. We can see the grid lines and everything if we open up the dev tools. And let's see, just want to click on that. Okay, so that will show us the, you know, where the columns and rows ends if you want to use that. But I'm not going to, just because I want it to be clear. So now let's make this, we don't want the header and nav to be even, I'm sorry, the header and search to be even, right? Because if we look at the image, the header is in a bigger area than the search is. So why don't we stretch this out a little bit and say header, header, search, which then we have to do nav 3 times. So now the header is a little wider, the search is a little thinner. Now let's bring in the main content and the aside. So again, if we look at the image, the main content is basically going to line up with the header, and the aside is going to line up with the search. So let's uncomment those two. Let's do this one line at a time. Okay, so if we do that, and then we can make this smaller. So again, we want the main content to align with the header. Now we have to add some grid areas to the new elements. So for the main, let's say grid area, set that to main, and then on the aside, grid area is going to be aside, or whatever you want to call it. And then let's go back up to the container, and we want another row. So here we're going to add another row, and we're going to say aside, not aside, sorry, main, aside. And now it lines up with the top, with the header and the search. And then you can probably guess what we're going to do for the footer. If you want to pause the video and do it on your own, you can, but we're going to uncomment that. With nothing added, it's just going to look like that. And then we want this to be on another row, so we're going to have another row, and we want the footer to stretch all the way across. And there's 3 columns, so we're going to do it 3 times. And then, of course, we need to add the grid area to connect it. So grid area, footer, and there we go. Okay, so now we have our layout. Now, if you wanted to make this responsive, what we would do, because I think this is important, because you know, obviously you're going to want your layouts to be responsive. So we can add a media query. I'm just going to do my max width 768. And then what I'm going to do is take the container, and to stack this, as you can imagine, would be pretty easy. We're just going to take our grid template areas, and we're going to set, we'll go on to the next line, and we want them all to be in a single column, so we can just do header, search, what's after that, nav, main, aside, and footer. Okay, so we're just stacking, and it's just physically exactly what we want the layout to look like. So once we hit 768, everything just stacks on top of each other. Okay, so that's grid template areas. And like I said, you're going to use this in lieu of grid template columns and grid template rows for the most part. So now what I want to do is take the Lumina creative project that we created and convert the gallery from Flexbox to CSS Grid. All right, now I wouldn't suggest overwriting what you've done. Just make a copy of the Lumina creative folder and then create a copy and rename it to Lumina Creative Grid or something like that. All right, so basically I want to use the grid to not only replicate what we've done, but also make it so we can span a few images, like have the second one go from here to here and then, you know, span down. So some are larger than the others. I think that's a cool effect when you have an image gallery. I don't think there's too many places where that layout works, but image galleries are definitely one of them. So, and you'll see just how much more effective the grid is for things like this. Like I said, you know, Flexbox is great for aligning your navigation or your footer cards or content areas, whatever. But CSS Grid is great for stuff like this. So let's jump into the index HTML, and I'm just going to change one thing here. So instead of gallery flex, we're going to add a class of gallery grid, which obviously is going to take our Flexbox styles away. And now let's go into our style sheet, and we're going to get rid of the gallery flex class here. For the gallery item, I'm going to get rid of the width where we used calc. And then also down in the media query, this gallery item, we're going to get rid of that as well. So now we're just kind of back at square one when it comes to columns and rows. So let's go to where we have our gallery stuff. Should probably put a comment here. All right, and then let's add in the gallery dash grid. Okay, and we want to set the display here to grid, and that doesn't do anything. Of course, we have to make our columns. So let's say grid template columns, and we're going to set that to repeat 3 times 1FR. So that way we have 3 across, and then we'll add a little bit of spacing with gap 20 pixels. All right, so I mean we're pretty much back to where we were, aside from the media query, because right now it's going to be 3 across no matter what. Now, to make it 2 across, it's very simple. That's what I mean about using CSS Grid for columns. I think it's easier than Flexbox because all we have to do is in the media query just change the grid template column, right? So let's go right here and let's say gallery dash grid and then set grid template, let's say grid template column or columns, and just set that to, now I want 2 across. In most cases, I would probably do 1FR, which would stack them one on top of each other, but I actually want 2, so I'm just going to say repeat 2 now, 1FR. So now on smaller screens, we have 2. So now we're back at where we were with Flexbox, and I think this is a bit cleaner than doing, you know, how we had it with Flex. So now let's do a little bit of spanning. So back where we have our gallery stuff, I want to take the second one, this image here, and I want to span it from here to here. So I want to span 2 with the column. So to select the second one, we'll use a pseudo selector or pseudo class. So gallery dash item, and I'm going to use nth of type. And then I want the second one, so I'm going to pass in 2. And then let's span the grid column. We're going to span 2 from where it's at. Now, this will affect the first one. The first one now will go down to here, but the image isn't filling that area. So if we want this image to fill in that whole area, we're going to set the gallery item image. So right here, let's set the width to 100%, the height to 100% of its container, and we're also going to set this object dash fit, and we're going to pass in cover. So now it'll cover that whole area, which is kind of cool. So it basically like zooms into it. And it's a little difficult to know what's going to affect what when you span. because obviously if you span rows or columns, it's going to affect the rest of the grid. So it can take some getting used to know what's going to change what. Now, the other thing I'd like to do is this one here, this flower, which I think is 7, I want to span that 2 columns and 2 rows, so we fill in the rest of the area. So let's target that with, I'll just copy this. And then we want to get the 7th one, so let's pass in 7. I do want to span the column 2, but I also want to span row 2, like that. All right, so I think that looks really good. I think that for an image gallery, this is better than having it just, 3 across through all out, Now we do have an issue on smaller screens. So we have this space here. What I'd like to do is make the first one big like this one, like the second one is, and then make the rest normal, like 2 across. So if we go down to our media query, let's go right here and let's target, let's say gallery, gallery item, and then we're going to get nth of type 1. And that one I actually do want to span 2 across 2. So let's say grid column, and we want to span 2. Okay, so now if we take a look, the first one is bigger. The second one I don't want to span 2, so what I'll do is just copy this, and let's take the second one, and let's set that to span 1. All right, then this one, we also want to clear that span. So again, we'll just take that's number 7. So for that, I'm going to set it to span 1. But remember, we also did the row, so we want to basically reset that as well. All right, so now on smaller screens, we have one big image at the top, and then we have 2 for the rest. So pretty cool. All right, so that's the grid version of Lumina Creative. Now we're going to move on and start to look at other parts of CSS that have to do with animation, transitions, the transform property. We're also going to look a little bit at some JavaScript, using JavaScript with CSS, because we're going to use it in the next couple of projects.